This next video, Web 03, is going to take us through some of the things that we did in Web 02, start extending it along and then actually putting it into the website itself. So we're going to do that by building our profile page, our master page, and our login control. So let's give that a go. Oh, going the wrong way. Okay, we've got our login user control, got our error message, we've got a blank user object control at the moment, and we've got a default page we just used to make sure that the create account actually worked. So what we're going to do now is going to add some things to our actual website. I'm going to start with a folder. Our folder is going to be called Style, and then I'm going to add another new item called a master page. ASP.NET does these things called master pages, which allow us to create a design that will exist on lots of different pages of our website. So instead of having to recreate the same HTML over and over again, we can basically create a single template, if you like, more so than just CSS, as in an HTML template, and then we can use that for various different pages of our actual website. So I'm going to call this one main.master. I'm going to put together a very simple HTML website. So in my style folder, I'm going to add a new style sheet, and the style sheet I'm just going to call this main style.css. At the moment, obviously the style sheet is blank. CSS is a way of styling the document, as in with images, with colors, with graphics, with positions, with layout. It's all your information that is not relevant data. And it's really useful to keep separate all of your website data, the things that you want to be sort of text on the screen, and your stylistic information. So things like screen readers can find it much easier to actually understand your website. A screen reader, by the way, is something that someone who is partially sighted might use to actually read out the writing on your website. So what we're going to do, main.master currently has a placeholder for the head, a content placeholder in the middle there, and a title. So let's give our website a title, the contact circle, and that will then now appear on every single page that we're going to build on our website. We're going to click and drag the main style all the way across like so, and it will just add in instantly a link to the style sheet, so that instantly we've got the same style sheet on every page now. And I'm going to build a very basic structure for my website. It's going to have a header, a main section, and a footer. So let's have a div for the header, a div for the footer. Div stands for divider, and it's used to create boxes on our forms. And every div, or every, in fact, HTML element can have its own identifier ID, which should really technically only appear once on the page, and then I can use the style guide to actually make some information about how these different items look. If you look at these through the web browser, let's put a copyright notice in here. Copyright, the moment I'm going to write 2014, because it is 2014, my name. Put in design view, you can see the divs don't actually do anything at the moment. They're just like basically containers. What I'm going to do next is take that and replace it with something called a literal, and call the literal LTR year. Don't you find it really annoying when you get a website and it shows like a previous year, like it's been made in 2012, 2013? First thing we're going to do on our website is make sure that it always shows the current year. So that's what that literal is. We're going to replace that with the current year. Our header at the moment is just going to contain the words the contact circle. And the main content is obviously going to store the majority of what we put into our main website. The header and the footer aren't really going to change between different pages. So I don't need to put a content placeholder in there, but if I wanted to have like an area inside the header which I can set on all the different pages that are made by the template, I'd create more content placeholders. I do realise that I'm kind of skimming over a lot of detail here. Partly it's time, I don't want to spend all day working on this one project, but B, the biggest thing is that I just want to give you a taste of all of this, and then hopefully you can do your own research into finding out what you want to know about a certain area. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to change the header. So if I use the hash symbol, which finding it on this keyboard is going to be interesting. There we go. Let's start with what we want our header to actually look like, and being CSS and being Visual Studio, it gives me a list of all different styles that I can put together straight away. Well, let's start with a width. We're going to make it 100% over the width of the screen. Let's make, I don't know, 200 pixels high. So if I now go to the default, so the main.master page, design mode, that's 200 pixels, probably a bit on the big side. Let's take it down to 150, and then let's take a look at it now. Just refresh to make sure it's matching. 150, still possibly a bit too big, maybe 100 pixels. That's probably looking a bit closer. We might like a nice background colour. Notice the American spelling. We can type in the name of a colour if we so wish. There's a few different options, maybe aqua for example, which is a very light blue, which I don't actually like very much. It's very 90s, I suppose. Or we can use a hashtag, and we can then put in, I call it hashtag, that's really awful. We can put in the colours in hexadecimal, or if you want to, you can put the colours in as numbers for red, green and blue. 0 being black, 255 being maximum. So maximum red, green and blue together makes white. So 255, 255, 255 makes white. I'm going to try a nice blue, too purpley a bit. So we'll take the red down to maybe 80. Yeah, it's probably about the colour I'm looking for. Maybe take the green back down as well. But you can play with the colours however you want on there. So the word's the contact circle, not very big, so let's change the size of the font in size to maybe, I don't know, 30 points. So let's have a look at that. Yeah, not very modern looking in style, so let's change the font family to something like if we do Sego UI as the first one, that's a Windows 8 format. The Vetica that's an iOS based format, so we do a list because the first one will be used if it's available on that computer. If it's not, it jumps to the next one and so on. Maybe Calibri, maybe Verdana. Finally, I'm going to select sans serif, which means just a font with no serif. So that's the font that we got. Yeah, I think that looks about right. Maybe we might want to put the text down a little bit. So we might say padding top, I don't know, 20 pixels or so. Make it a little bit more centered, maybe 30 pixels. Padding can actually make a difference to the size of an object as well. Yeah, I think that's probably about where I want to be. So we'll leave it as that for now. So I'm just going to save all of that. So we've now got our main master page. My default page obviously doesn't use the master page, it's just a blank one, so we're going to delete that. It was just a test to see if we could actually access the controls anyway. And now I'm going to add another new item, same name, but this time I'm going to use web form using master page and call it default. So I get to choose which master page. It's this one that's inside the main browser. And you can see now that my header and footers come from the master page, and where content placeholder is, I can type some words and writing as I need to. The footer's not looking particularly neat and tidy, so let's do some stuff with the footer as well. Right, what should we do with the footer? Well, I think this time we'll have central line text, so text align center. We use the same font family, but this time we'll make the font size maybe 8. You want it quite small really, so we'll copy and paste, but then we'll put it in like that. So now that looks alright. Do we really want a different colour? Maybe a light grey we could have. Well, if 255, 255, 255 is white, a light grey would be something like maybe 200 on all the values. So let's have a look now. That's nice, quite a nice light grey. You can still see the writing okay. So now when we go back to our default page, you'll see it's automatically changed. It's greyed, a slightly grey background to show that it's not something that we can change. We can only change what's in the content placeholder. But that's not looking too bad now. Let's get our literal LTR year working. So I'm going to go back to the main.master, right click view code and say if this is the first time the page is switched on, which is what that means if it's not been posted back yet, LTR year.text equals system.datetime now.year. So now whenever we run the page, it'll always show the year showing there. You may see it's underlined in red showing there's an error. That's because it's a number and we need to tell it to turn into a piece of writing, so we use the toString value. When I'm viewing it on this system, you can see it still says literal LTR year. That's because it's still not run the code yet. But if I actually run this default page by right clicking view in browser, note you have to run a page like default, you can't run the master page. Yeah, let's ask me later. Thank you. You can now see it says copyright 2014 Chris Lewis. So we've got ourselves quite a nice looking browser. You may notice as well the border is still white around the edges. That's built into all normal browsers. There's like a margin, if you like. We can get rid of that by saying margin 0 pixels on our body, and if we now run the page, you'll see the blue now goes all the way to the edges, which is just as I want it to look really. So it's looking a little bit yeah, pseudo Facebooky ish in terms of the colour scheme. I know it's a slightly darker blue, it's kind of deliberate. I don't think I'll get away with actually using real blue. So we're going to add in our control now for our login. I'm going to create a new folder to store my controls. And what I mean by controls, we're going to use something called a web user control. I'm going to call it login. This is again a bit like we've pre-packaged all our program code into a separate file, a DLL file. But all the different items that make up our page, we're actually going to pre-package into these things called web user controls, which we can then drag and drop onto our forms in the right places, and they'll just then run the code that we want to. So this is where we're actually going to be able to log in to our system. I'm going to create a couple of div boxes because I'm going to use div for my layout, which is the way that most web developers now use for layout. And I'm going to do it to make it look a bit like a table. So if you imagine this is a left-hand side, this is the right-hand side, and this top bit here to this bit here is a row of our table. We're going to have 3 rows in our table. We can't use IDs for more than one item in a page, that's what I've told you already. So we're going to use something called a class, and I'm going to call this one a table row. And I'm going to do the same then for this table row and this table row. And then if we make this one called table left, and then we make this one called table right. I've just accidentally pressed the wrong button, so let's do that. And then to speed things up, I'll just copy and paste over these. And classes in a style sheet work the same way as an ID, but instead of putting a hash symbol in front of it, we actually put a dot, a full stop, or a period. So I'm going to put username, password, and then this bottom one is going to be used for our button. So then I'm going to add, double click a login button. So this is our BN login. Text is going to be login. I'm going to put a text box here, text box here, give this the name text username, text password. I'm then going to move into design mode. At the moment everything's all one thing under another, and it will look like that for the whole control all the time. It'll only change when I change the style and actually put that control on a web page which has this style sheet attached. So for table row, I'm actually going to set a maximum width. Let's try 200 pixels and see how we go with that. And then table left, I'm going to set that to be a width of 100. Thinking ahead already, I think actually I'm going to make that 300 pixels. And now I want them to sort of float next to each other. I'm going to use float left on both the table left and table right. And I can use have both of them listed under one item. If I put a comma in like that, this means that I can actually have the same style showing on both table left and table right. Because a cascading style sheet shows you, it sets the style first of all, and then if anything changes later on, that's when it will then update that style with extra information. So at this point, both table left and table right are going to have the same style, width 100, float left. And I'm also then going to add in text align right, because I want my labels on the left hand control to be right aligned. But then I'm going to change some of those items for table right. So if I now set underneath the width of being 200 pixels and and then text align left. So I overwrite the width and the text align. Realise that we've then only actually using the float in both. So to make life a bit easier and a bit less programmatically difficult on the processor, it's not really major a problem these days, but we're going to just make it so that our two items are just for float left. Then we'll do table left as a width of 100, text line right, table right width 200, text line left. So we're setting table left and table right as we want to set it, really. Okay. So although it won't look any different here, if we then build our project as such and go to our master page, main.master, I'm going to drag the login control next to the contact circle. First thing you may notice, yeah, bit of a problem. Login's got the same size writing as the contact circle. Didn't expect that, did you? And also, it's kind of appearing underneath because it's just one thing after the text. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put our login into something called login. So we're going to create another div, and our login control is actually going to go into this div tag itself. And because it's an ID, we're going to use hashtag. I hate that phrase because it's so Twitter based, but it's what everyone calls it now. And this one we're going to make some changes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to float it to the right of the screen, the login control. We're not going to change the background colour, but we are going to change the font size. The font family is actually going to be inherited from header because this div is actually within header. So all we actually need to do is change the size. I'm going to change it to 10 point. You can use point or pixel for your sizes. Choice is yours. So now what we'll do is go onto the main page again. Now you see it's username password login, but it still appears under the writing. Well, that's because although it's told it to float right, sorry, it does it after the point where it's been added, and at the moment it's been added after our writing. If we move it being before our writing, like so, you'll see it appears nicely in line because it floats it to the right, and then what would normally come after it appears to be before it. So now we've got this really nice looking contact circle, username, password, login. Looks quite nice. The login button, where it is there, is actually on div table right, and yet appears directly underneath the username and password. Again, that's not exactly what we want, and that's because there's actually nothing inside table left. So we're going to put a special symbol, the ampersand MBSP, which means space. If we build it again and now go to there, we can see our login button is actually underneath our username and password. So it looks, especially if we go to a default page and view in browser, like a proper professional website. As you can see, the username and password is always on the right hand side, and as I shrink it down, there's a bit of a problem. The writing kind of goes underneath, and because I've set the height on my header, it doesn't look quite as it should do. Is there any way I can fix that? Well, yes, again, there is. I can use my style sheet. I can say something really clever where I can say, if anything overflows over the top of the header, we can hide it. This will kind of mean, of course, that if we look at our default page now, we can lose the words the contact circle as we shrink it down. Just sort of see the bottom of it. Not so good. Maybe it'd be better if the screen got to a certain size for it to slightly change style. We can do that as well. What we can use is a technique that you may see on other websites. If I think of one that might be a good one to use, if I use Engadget, we can make it specific to our size. It's called reactive programming. It's got other names as well, responsive programming and things like that, where depending on how big and wide your screen is, it actually changes the style. So in this particular case, in full screen, it looks like this, as you can see, but as I start shrinking it down, if I can just grab it, it's a bit difficult, I'm using a touchpad, there's the edge. As I start shrinking it down, the website itself actually starts changing until eventually it ends up in a mobile format, because it assumes that if your screen size is this sort of wide, it must be a mobile phone. As you can see, it then changes style based on the size of the page. So how can we actually do that? Well, we can do some really clever stuff where we can actually say, if I use the @ sign, media screen and min width, if I say that if the width goes down to 720 pixels, which as a start point, what will happen now is that because this is listed after header, if those criteria are met, if it's being viewed on a screen and the width's less than 720, we're going to change some of the style. Well, what I'm going to change is I'm actually going to change the font size down to 18 points, let's say. I don't need to change background colour or width or height. I'm going to leave those as they are. I'm going to change the font size. The font family is going to stay the same. The padding to the top, I'm actually going to now set to being 0 pixels, so there's now no padding at the top either. And I'm then going to change the login so there's no float. So I'm going to say clear both, which is just to clear any floating, and again keep the font size on that at 10 points. I'm then going to move my login control to be above my media set there. If I now run that, my contact circle, problem, it's now setting that no matter what. It's because I've used min width instead of max width. Sorry, my mistake. Let's do that again. That's much better. So we're now looking at it at full screen, and then as I shrink it down, it suddenly changes size. So now I've got the words, the contact circle. So if it works on a mobile phone, you get your login right at the top, which is as you'd like it on a mobile phone, and you can still see the phrase, the contact circle. and then as time moves on it then moves to a different size, etc., depending on what format you're actually looking at. So actually this is the format you would see on a iPad, for example, that is in portrait format, and if you move to it in landscape format it would look like this. So I'm quite pleased with that. That's how I'm going to keep it at this point. Let's just make sure we can view exactly what's going on with our tabs. Now, at the moment, how do we actually log in? Well, we've got a login control. We've not really done much with it yet. What I do want to do is add some validation. I'm not going to allow the button to be pressed until you've typed in a username and password. So I'm going to make both of these required field by finding the required field validator, double clicking on it. Then I'm going to go to the properties on this first required field, and I'm going to say, well, this is going to be the required field for username, so control to validate is username. This is going to be the one for the password. Normally we would have a red star, so let's change the fore color to red and change the text to a star, because that's what people expect these days on a screen. So there we go, red star. We then need to tell the computer which button to check the validation with. So we have this thing called a validation group. I'm going to call it the validation group login, and I'm going to set that on that control and this control, and I have to set it on the button as well. So now when I press this button, the first thing the computer will do using JavaScript is check that something's been entered into username and password. You cannot rely on the fact that you've got these validation controls when you get your code server side, because it may well be that someone's turned off JavaScript to get around these sort of validations. The text password, obviously I want to change from being a single line to a password control, which means that it won't appear on the screen, which is kind of important. So let's just check it in our web browser again. So now I can type in a username and I type in a password and it doesn't come up on the screen. This being a newer browser, I can actually choose to view my, I think it's this is version 11 of Internet Explorer. I can actually view my password by clicking a button, but that's just built in. And I've got a login button as well, which works. I can remember a password. If I leave something blank, like I don't type in a username, then the stars appear, so I can I've double checked that the validation is actually working. You may notice the password box and username box is slightly different in size. That is, as soon as you change something to a typed password, it does actually change the size of the box slightly. If you want to make them both the same size, you can leave that up to you. So we've got ourselves a username password control. It doesn't actually log us in yet though, so let's see what we can do for the login. Well, we haven't yet created any code in our login user. We've got a create account, but we haven't got in a login user account. So let's create a new public, and we're going to return a string. We're going to return the user ID, and we're going to use login user string username string password. And again, at the moment, we just really want to check. We're not going to particularly do anything with the database or anything like that. We'll leave that for a later piece of code. So we just want to check that it's actually talking to this piece of code and it's actually working, at least at this point. We try and do this so that we're finding errors as they happen, rather than trying to find out what's gone wrong when you've got all the program code all completed, and it's much harder to actually find out what's going wrong where. So this makes life a lot quicker and easier. What we'll do is we'll say if username equals so we're going to create login user. Apologies, I had to just stop the video and start it again. If username equals we're going to just use a very simple login system where it's literally going to be a username of Chris and a password equals and we're going to return a 1, which is going to be our fake login, and if it's not Chris password, we're going to return a blank. A blank is going to mean that there's no user found. So we've actually written a very simple piece of code to log in our user. And now it's fixed, there's no database. That will be something that we do afterwards. So we're going to go on to our login control. Again, at the top we need to put in our using contact circle code. So login user, I'm going to call them my variable, just simply user. Create a new one, then usr dot login user, and then we're going to give it the username dot text and password dot text, and then we're going to do string user ID equals that. If user ID equals blank, the user's not been recognised. Where can we put the information in? Well, let's have a look at our login control. If we imagine it on the master page, it goes to default, we could actually have a fourth line under here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have another row on the login control there. So I'm going to create another class table row. And I'm going to be able to put error messages in here. So I'm going to use a label control and then call it LB error. And at the moment it just says label. We're going to change the forecolor to red of our label. Change the text to blank at the moment. There's no error message. But then what we can do is, if the user ID is blank on login, LB error dot text equals username password not recognized, please try again. If it is possible to log them in, as you may remember from Web01, we've got this thing called session state in ASP.NET, and what we're going to do is we're going to save the user ID into session state so that we can use it on various different pages. So we're going to add in an item into session state. We're going to call it user ID, and we're going to save what's in our user ID variable. There we go. So now we've got our logged in user. Now the thing is, the login page itself, hold on 1 second, why is login user is going to be a problem. Sorry, this is actually my fault, I didn't mean to do this. If I change this into just login rather than login user, we won't have any problems, because I was calling it login user, which you can't do. You can't give something the same name. I'd like to say that was deliberate. It wasn't, but I'm going to pretend it was. So that's deliberate to show you what happens if you call a function by the same name as the object it's inside. I doubt very many people are going to watch this video anyway, so I don't think it's going to matter. So now I can make this work. So if the user ID is blank, it's just going to tell us please try again. If it isn't blank, it's going to add it to the user ID. But that means when we've got our program running on our default page, which we'll do now, so we'll start with a username that's not going to be recognised. Let's do username of Bob and the password of 1234. Username password not recognised, please try again. That red really isn't very nice with this blue, but we can work on that in the future. We'll do Chris and the password of password. Login. It's fine, but that's still appearing. It hasn't shown anything on the screen to show that I've logged in. So what I'm going to do now is have a slight change to my actual login page. So I'm going to create something called a panel, and I have pn login and another panel control underneath, which is going to be called pn welcome. I'm going to move the close panel to the end of all my code that I've just typed in. So my pn login, if you like, encloses everything I've already got. And at the moment I'm just going to say welcome user on pn user. In the code now, I'm going to actually look and say if this is postback. So I'm going to again check the first time that this appears. as in this control's created when you first load up the website, if session user ID equals null, which means there's no session listed, that means there's no one logged in at the moment, we'll show pn_login.visible equals true, and we're going to hide welcome. If someone is logged in, so session ID is on there, we'll do the opposite. So false, true. And when the person logs in, not only do we add the session, we actually make it visible on here as well. So now if I go to the default page, view in browser, type in a username of Chris and a password, I log in, it's still not working out. Something's not working right here. So what we need to do now is debug our code. So on this grey area of the line here, I'm going to put a little red break point, as it's called, in our code. So what will happen is when this piece of code actually runs, it will pause on that line and then go into the program code. So let's run this in debug mode. I'm going to right click on default and say set a startup page, and I'm going to run the program code by pressing the play button at the top. So I'm in debug mode now, so I can actually check what's happening in my program as it's going. And I'm going to type in Chris, and the password is obviously password that we've automatically typed in. But I'm going to retype it because I'm going to use a lowercase p, and actually that's what turns out to be the problem. So we can actually examine what's inside each of these items by just moving our mouse cursor over each of the text bits. I can then use this button here to go into the code and find out what's happening. So username equals Chris. If I want to, I can actually check that by highlighting the whole lot, right clicking, quick watch, and it'll give me the result. There you go, the value is true. That section is true. But is password equal to password? Well, it's not. False. Because the password is currently a lowercase p, and it is case sensitive. So that is why I cannot log in at the moment. So it's not a problem in my program code, it's a problem with the password. I'll now use a capital P password, log in, and it will now check it again. It will always use this breakpoint until I close it off. So I'm going to turn it off so it doesn't run a third time. Now it is going to work. Returns a 1, user ID does not equal 1, so it goes through, adds the session, and then it's going to show the welcome message. So now when I go back into my code, welcome user appears. We're getting somewhere. We've got a login system. We haven't yet got a profile system, and that's going to be the next video.